July 13th, 1984. The music was still playing when Philippe Wynne's body began to fail. In the middle of a live performance at a nightclub in Oakland, he collapsed on stage. Not backstage, not later, but right there in front of the crowd. By the next day, he was dead. He was just 43 years old. The headlines said, "Heart attack. End of story." But that explanation barely scratches the surface. Behind the voice that powered the spinner's biggest hits was a man carrying addiction, isolation, and secrets he couldn't afford to reveal in an industry ruled by toughness and silence. What really led to that moment under the lights? What had Wynne been fighting long before his heart gave out? This is the side of Philippe Wynne few ever talked about. Let's go straight to the beginning, because Philippe Wynne's pain didn't start on a stage in 1984. It started decades earlier. Philippe Wynne was born Philippe Walker on April 3, 1941, in Cincinnati, Ohio. Music was in his blood from the start. He grew up in the church, singing alongside his brother, sisters, and extended family. His grandparents were deeply devoted to church music, and those early harmonies weren't just lessons in sound, they were survival. Music was the one place where young Philippe felt held together. That stability didn't last long. In 1947, his parents divorced after his mother, Anna, left Cincinnati and ran off to Detroit with another man. Philippe's father, Degree Walker, was granted full custody, but his job as a traveling construction contractor kept him away for long stretches. With no one to watch the children, he made a devastating decision. Philippe, his brother, and his sisters were placed in an orphanage for black children. Years later, Philippe would say the cruelest part wasn't the orphanage itself. It was knowing both of his parents were still alive. That knowledge cut deeper than abandonment ever could. After 5 years, Philippe and his brother Michael ran away. Michael headed north to Detroit to find their mother. Philippe stayed behind in Cincinnati, eventually reconnecting with his father for a time, while his sisters remained in the orphanage. Even as a child, his life was already fractured, split between loyalty, loss, and survival. Back in Cincinnati, Philippe bounced between relatives, took whatever jobs he could find, and grew up fast. At just 15 years old, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He lied about his age and enlisted in the military. Somehow, they believed he was 18 and let him in. The military gave him structure, but it didn't tame his spirit. Over 7 years of service, he worked in infantry, artillery, and eventually trained as a medical specialist. He earned his GED, but what truly kept him alive were two things: boxing and singing. Music followed him everywhere, even into uniform. It was during this period that he crossed paths with Otis Redding, and for a time, Philippe even sang with Otis's band, an early glimpse of the greatness waiting to break through. After leaving the military, Philippe reunited with his brother in Detroit. Together, they formed a gospel group called the Walker Singers, returning briefly to the spiritual roots that had once saved him. But gospel didn't pay the bills, and reality forced another pivot. Philippe walked away from church music and returned to Cincinnati, choosing R&B instead. As he later admitted, secular music was where the money was. That was also when he shed his father's name. He dropped Walker, took his mother's surname Wynne, added an E, and became Philippe Wynne, a quiet reinvention, and maybe a way to rewrite a story that had hurt him too deeply. Not long after, fate intervened. Philippe met Bootsy Collins and his brother Catfish Collins, who had just formed a band called the Pacemakers. They needed a lead singer. Philippe stepped into the role, and everything changed. While working at Cincinnati's King Records studio, the Pacemakers caught the attention of James Brown himself. Brown was impressed enough to help them land work as a house band, backing artists in the studio. That opportunity opened doors to touring, session work, and exposure Philippe had never imagined. Fame hadn't broken him yet, but the foundation of pain was already there, quietly shaping the man behind the voice. Not long after the pacemakers had started gaining momentum, everything changed with one urgent phone call. James Brown was in crisis. His band had just walked out, Maceo Parker and others were gone, and he needed musicians immediately. Brown turned to the pacemakers, pulling them straight into his orbit. Once they joined his backing band, the JBs, it was chaos and brilliance all at once. They were suddenly part of history, powering records like Sex Machine, Superbad, Soul Power, and Bewildered. For Philippe Wynne, it was like being dropped into the engine room of funk itself, intense, disciplined, and unforgiving. But the shine didn't last. James Brown ran his band like a military unit. Miss a note, get fined. Show up late, get docked pay. Brown constantly accused Bootsy Collins of using drugs, creating tension that never eased. The pressure became unbearable. Within months, the pacemakers had had enough. They quit, walking away from one of the most powerful men in music because the rules were crushing their spirit. Back home in Cincinnati, the group regrouped, but Philippe's path began to drift. He traveled overseas, landing in Germany, where he became the lead singer of a Liberian band called the Afro Kings. For a while, he disappeared from the American scene entirely, sharpening his voice and stage presence far from home. Then, out of nowhere, another call came, one that would define his legacy. The call was from the Spinners. To understand how big that moment was, you have to rewind. The Spinners had been grinding for years, made up of Billy Henderson, Henry Fambro, Purvis Jackson, Bobby Smith, and lead singer G.C. Cameron, who also happened to be Philippe Wynne's cousin. In 1970, they finally broke through with It's a Shame, a hit written and produced by Stevie Wonder and Sarita Wright. The song was everywhere, but success at Motown came with limits. Berry Gordy's attention was elsewhere, and the Spinners felt overlooked. Encouraged by Aretha Franklin, they made a bold move to Atlantic Records, a label that, at the time, had no male vocal groups and plenty of room for them to shine. But G.C. Cameron stayed behind at Motown, chasing a solo career and tangled in a personal scandal of his own. Before stepping away, he told the group something crucial. Philippe is the one. He insisted Wynne should replace him. When Philippe met the Spinners, the decision wasn't immediate, but the endorsements piled up. Eddie Kendricks personally vouched for him, telling the group they'd be crazy not to bring Philippe in. Originally, they also wanted his entire backing band, the House Guests. But Bootsy and Catfish had another destiny waiting. Funk was calling louder than harmony, and they joined George Clinton and Parliament, leaving Philippe to walk forward alone. And so he did. Philippe Wynne officially became the lead singer of the Spinners, a move that would transform the group into soul legends, even as it quietly set him on a path toward triumph, inner conflict, and a tragic ending no one could have predicted. With the Spinners officially signed to Atlantic Records, everything finally clicked into place, and the timing couldn't have been better. Atlantic paired them with Thom Bell, one of the most visionary producers in soul music. Bell had already helped shape the lush, elegant Philadelphia soul sound through his work with acts like the Delphonics and the Stylistics, and now he was ready to do something bold, reintroduce a Detroit group through a Philly lens. To complete the formula, Bell brought in the late Linda Creed, one of the greatest songwriters of her generation. Her pen carried emotional weight, vulnerability, and sophistication, exactly what Philippe Wynne's voice could elevate to another level. Together, Bell and Creed reshaped the Spinners' identity without stripping away their roots, giving them a smooth, orchestral sound that felt both timeless and urgent. In April 1973, the transformation paid off. The group released their self-titled album Spinners, and it exploded, hitting #1 on the Billboard Top Soul LPs chart and producing 3 #1 R&B singles. The first was I'll Be Around, led by Bobby Smith, which spent 5 weeks at #1 on the R&B chart and sold over 1 million copies. The second, Could It Be I'm Falling in Love featured shared lead vocals by Bobby Smith and Philippe Wynne, climbing to #1 on the R&B chart and number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100, also crossing the million-seller mark. Then came One of a Kind, Love Affair, another #1 R&B hit, spending 4 weeks at the top and earning gold certification. Momentum carried straight into their next release. In March 1974, the Spinners dropped Mighty Love, an album that confirmed this wasn't luck. It was dominance. The title track Mighty Love hit #1 on the R&B singles chart, while songs like I'm Coming Home and Love Don't Love Nobody became staples on late-night radio, especially on Quiet Storm playlists. Philippe's voice, elastic, emotional, and unmistakable, was now one of the most recognizable in soul music. That same year, their success went global. The Spinners traveled to Africa to perform at the legendary Rumble in the Jungle concert tied to the Muhammad Ali versus George Foreman fight. Footage even captured Philippe joking, sparring, and shadowboxing with Ali. Two performers from different worlds, both larger than life. And they still weren't done. In December 1974, the group released New and Improved, which included their biggest crossover hit yet. Then Came You, featuring Dionne Warwick. The song soared to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, cementing the Spinners and Philippe Wynne as full-blown superstars. What still blows people's minds is that Dionne Warwick's Then Came. You didn't just top the charts. It became the first number. One single of her entire career. After all those years, all those hits, it took this collaboration to finally push her to the top. The song was even nominated for a Grammy. But for many fans, the true emotional centerpiece of that era wasn't the crossover smash. It was Sadie. When Philippe Wynne took the lead on Sadie, something shifted. That performance stamped him as one of the most distinctive voices in soul music. His phrasing, his control, the ache in his delivery, it wasn't just singing, it was testimony. Live footage from the era tells the story better than words ever could. The moment he started Sadie, crowds lost it. People leaned in, people cried. That song became a forever classic, and it made it clear Philippe wasn't just part of the group. He was something rare. And the hits didn't slow down. In 1975, Games People Play went straight to #1. The following year, the Spinners released Happiness Is Being with the Spinners, which produced one of their most iconic records, the Rubberband Man. Philippe again handled lead vocals, driving the song to #1 on the Billboard Hot Soul Singles chart and #2 on the Hot 100, where it stayed for 3 weeks. Decades later, it would still be ranked among Detroit's greatest songs, a testament to how deeply that record embedded itself into American culture. But with success came temptation. Industry voices started whispering in Philippe's ear, telling him what they'd told others before him, that he didn't need the group anymore. It was the same playbook used on Diana Ross, on David Ruffin. The idea took hold. Philippe began pushing for a name change, Philippe Wynne and the Spinners, or else he'd walk. The group tried to stop him. They knew things were good, better than good. They believed he would eventually go solo, sure, but not like this, not right when everything was working. They refused the name change, and with that, Philippe Wynne made the hardest decision of his life. At the height of their success, he left the group to go solo, convinced the spotlight was finally meant for him alone. After leaving the Spinners, Philippe made a move that surprised almost everyone. He hired Alan Thicke as his manager. Most people remember Thicke as the TV dad from Growing Pains or as the father of Robin Thicke, but long before that, he was a serious behind-the-scenes power player. He'd written television theme songs and worked deep inside the entertainment industry, and Philippe believed that kind of guidance could help him reinvent himself as a solo star. With that confidence, Philippe signed a solo deal with Cotillion Records, a subsidiary of Atlantic, under executive Henry Allen. In 1977, he released his debut solo album, Starting All Over. The title felt symbolic. This was Philippe betting everything on himself. But the music world didn't respond. The album barely made a ripple, received little promotion, and failed to chart. Almost as quickly as the deal was signed, it was over. Philippe was dropped. Needing momentum, he reconnected with familiar creative energy, teaming back up with Bootsy Collins and George Clinton. That reunion paid off when Philippe appeared on Funkadelic's Not Just Knee Deep, a track that exploded to #1 on the R&B charts and later became immortal through its sampling by De La Soul on Me, Myself and I. For a moment, it felt like Philippe had found solid ground again. That momentum led him to George Clinton's label, Uncle Jam Records, where he released his second solo album, Win Jammin', in 1980. Once again, the results were disappointing. The album failed to gain traction, and Philippe was quietly released from the label. By then, the industry had begun to move on, even if his voice hadn't lost an ounce of its power. In 1983, Philippe made one final push. He signed with Sugar Hill Records and released his last solo album, Philippe Wynne. He went back on the road, promoting the record the only way he knew how, live, raw, and full of soul. Then came July 13, 1984. It was a Friday night at a small Oakland nightclub called Ivy's. About 200 people packed the room. Philippe was energetic, animated, fully in command of the stage, singing like a man who still believed the best was ahead. No one in that crowd knew they were witnessing the final performance of a soul legend whose voice had carried joy, pain, and heartbreak for an entire generation. By the end of that night, it no longer felt like a small club show. It felt like a love letter. After every song, Philippe Wynne stepped off the stage, walked straight into the crowd, shook hands, hugged people, and thanked them personally. The audience rose to its feet again and again, refusing to let him leave. Each standing ovation pulled him back for another encore, and Philippe kept giving them more, smiling, sweating, fully alive in the moment. On the third return, he didn't stay on stage. He moved through the audience while singing, surrounded by people who adored him, soaking in the energy. Then, in the middle of It Takes a Fool to Learn That Love Don't Love Nobody, something went terribly wrong. Philippe dropped the microphone and collapsed onto the floor right there among the crowd. Panic set in instantly. Fans screamed and cried. A nurse and several off-duty police officers who were in attendance rushed to help, doing everything they could as people backed away in shock. The room that had been filled with joy minutes earlier turned silent and terrified. Philippe was rushed to the hospital, but just an hour later, he was pronounced dead from a massive heart attack. He was only 43 years old. What came after was almost as heartbreaking. According to his brother Michael, only 8 people attended Philippe's funeral. 8. A man whose voice had lifted millions, laid to rest in near silence. Michael later shared that Philippe had been thinking seriously about returning to gospel music toward the end of his life, coming full circle to the church where his singing began. Wynne's personal life carried its own quiet weight, marked by love, movement, and later, devastating loss. On February 1, 1973, he married Ava LaFleur in Las Vegas, Nevada. Ava was from Compton, California, and not long after Philippe left the Spinners, the couple relocated to California, hoping for a fresh start away from the constant pull of the road. Together they built a family that, for a time, gave Wynne a sense of grounding he hadn't always known in his turbulent career. They had 2 sons together, Emmanuel Wynne, born in 1974, and Alvarez Escalante Wynne, born in 1975. Philippe also had an older son, Cedric, born in April 1973, who would later settle in Detroit, Michigan. Friends said Wynne took pride in being a father, even when fame and financial instability made consistency difficult. Behind the powerful stage presence was a man trying to balance music, responsibility, and the desire to give his children a better life than the one he'd known growing up. Over time, the marriage between Philippe and Ava unraveled, and the couple eventually divorced. But the family bond never truly disappeared, and neither did tragedy. In 1999, their son Alvarez was killed in a drive-by shooting in Compton, a loss that shattered what remained of the family's emotional foundation. Just 2 years later, fate struck again. Emmanuel, who was living in Daytona Beach, Florida, drowned in 2001 while trying to save another man's life. His final act was one of courage and selflessness, and he was posthumously awarded the Carnegie Medal for heroism. The losses of both sons cast a long shadow over Wynne's legacy, turning what was already a tragic story into something almost unbearably heavy. For those who look back on Philippe Wynne's life, his soaring voice and joyful performances now exist alongside a deeply human story of love, heartbreak, and sacrifice, one that few people ever saw while he was alive. Today, the Spinners still perform with newer members, carrying the legacy forward. Only one original member remains, Henry Fambro. The group was inducted into the Vocal Group Hall of Fame in 1999 and received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame back in 1976. But for many fans, the soul of the Spinners will always be Philippe Wynne, the man with the elastic voice, the open heart, and the tragic ending that came far too soon. Philippe Wynne's legacy is usually told through his voice, the aching tenderness of Sadie, the swagger of the Rubberband Man, the way he could turn joy and sorrow into the same note. But to stop there misses something essential. Wynne's impact wasn't only artistic, it was human. Long after the applause faded, people who knew him remembered not just how he sang, but how he gave. Wynne came from instability, abandonment, and institutions that taught him early how easily people could be forgotten. That history shaped his generosity. Friends, family members, and musicians who crossed his path consistently described him as someone who shared first and worried later. He didn't talk about charity as a brand or a strategy. To him, giving back wasn't a public act, it was survival turned outward. During the peak years with the Spinners in the early to mid-1970s, Wynne was earning real money for the first time in his life. Industry figures from that era estimate that top-tier soul groups signed to major labels like Atlantic Records were typically paid between $10,000 and $25,000 per week during heavy touring periods, sometimes more for international shows and special events. While contracts heavily favored labels, Wynne's income at his height likely placed him among the more comfortable R&B performers of the decade. His estimated net worth at his peak has been placed by music historians at between $1 million and $2 million. Significant money at the time, especially for a black artist who had grown up with almost nothing. But Wynne didn't live like a star obsessed with excess. Unlike many of his peers, he wasn't known for extravagant mansions, fleets of luxury cars, or flashy jewelry. His lifestyle was relatively modest. He spent freely on clothes. Stage wear mattered to him, but much of his money went to people rather than things. Bandmates recalled him paying hotel bills for struggling musicians, covering medical costs quietly, and slipping cash to families in need without ever announcing it. One of the places Wynne gave most consistently was the black church community, particularly gospel programs connected to youth music education. Though exact donation records were never formalized, those close to him said he regularly gave thousands of dollars at a time to churches in Cincinnati, Detroit, and later California, often earmarked for choir programs, instruments, or transportation for kids who couldn't afford lessons. Giving to the church wasn't charity to Wynne, it was repayment. Church music had saved him as a child, and he believed it deserved protection. He was also known for supporting community benefit concerts, especially in the late 1970s and early 1980s when his mainstream profile had dimmed. Wynne frequently performed for free or at reduced rates for neighborhood fundraisers, addiction recovery benefits, and family support events, particularly in black communities affected by violence and poverty. Promoters recalled him asking one question before agreeing to shows like these: "Who's this really for?" Wynne spoke openly about giving in interviews, though never with polish. One quote often repeated by those who knew him came from a small radio interview in the early 1980s, when he said, "If God gave me a voice that feeds me, then that voice gotta feed somebody else too." Another time, when asked why he didn't save more aggressively, he shrugged and said, "Money don't hug you back, people do." That philosophy sometimes hurt him financially. Wynne wasn't known as a careful businessman, and his generosity, combined with uneven management after leaving the Spinners, meant his wealth declined sharply in his later years. By the early 1980s, friends said he was living gig to gig, often supporting others while neglecting his own long-term security. Still, he didn't regret it. "I've been broke before," he once joked backstage. "Being greedy scares me more than being broke." Even in his final years, performing in smaller clubs, Wynne kept the same habits. After shows, he'd walk into the crowd, shake hands, thank people personally, and often give away parts of his pay to venue staff or struggling musicians he'd just met. On the night of his death, July 13, 1984, he had already gone into the audience multiple times, embracing fans and thanking them before collapsing mid-performance. Philippe Wynne died with far less money than he once had, but his wealth had already been spent where it mattered: in music, in people, in communities that remembered him not as a distant star, but as a man who showed up. His legacy isn't just that he sang beautifully, it's that he lived generously. And in the end, that may be the most powerful note he ever left behind. Do you think Philippe Wynne's legacy should be remembered more for his voice, or for the way he gave himself to others? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, honest, human, and untold, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more content like this. I'll see you next time. Stay tuned.